So, I wrote a pitch for an article on how I became a massive supporter of genetic engineering after reading a book called The Bell Curve. This book gave me a massive existential crisis when I was about 17 and led me to conclude some things that I would have really preferred not concluding. I therefore put my pitch on Reddit to see if people could see a problem with my argument that I myself had not thought of, because if I am wrong then I would like to know why so I can stop being miserable, but if I am right then I have something to say about genetic engineering that needs to be circulating amongst the broader community. As GGE, or germline genetic editing, is a biological, philosophical and legal problem, I uploaded my stance onto the following subreddits: r/genetics, r/philosophy, r/biology, r/legal and r/ethics. My post was removed from r/legal, r/philosophy and r/biology, so many of the criticisms I got I cannot respond to. I am hoping what I managed to record will be a sufficient compromise. I would say I hope you enjoy, but if I'm doing my job right, you're about to have a massive existential crisis, so I apologise in advance. To start, I shall read the pitch that I uploaded onto r/ethics. Why liberalising laws on germline genetic engineering is a moral imperative, even outside of single gene disorders. Hello. I am writing a paper on an ethical idea which I want to get published and circulating amongst people who are not me. The topic is controversial as it involves the highly inflammatory bell curve by Richard Herrnstein and Murray, but as far as I can tell, the only reason this topic hasn't been breached is simply because of how controversial it is. I want to write my pitch out for you here so you can see if there are any problems. You see, the Centre for Genetics and Society is an institute that specialises in pointing out all the ways in which a large-scale acceptance of genetic engineering will lead to a Gattaca-like society or Brave New World where a genetic elite rule over the genetic inferiors in a genetic caste system. What they frequently overlook is that, for the most part, this is happening anyways. Herrnstein and Murray pointed out back in 1995 that IQ, which is mostly genetic, is a bigger predictor of life success than any other single variable. This includes trait conscientiousness, which itself is largely genetic, and also means that having a high IQ is literally a bigger predictor of achieving success in life than working hard and deserving it. As environmental differences are solved with time, such as through government interventions, reducing rates of poverty and technological improvements, all this means is that societal status will increasingly be determined by genetic factors. Even in the 21st century, where things are far from perfect from the environmental egalitarian perspective, Robert Plomin has just written a new book called Blueprint, and Catherine Page Harden has written a book called The Genetic Lottery, which makes a strong case that inherent biological programming is the single biggest predictor of where you are in the social ladder. This is not so bad if you are at the top of the hierarchy, a gifted student who gets a full scholarship to Harvard and then a six-figure salary at Facebook, as an example. But let's say you are on the other end of the spectrum. What then? I come from a special ed background. I was diagnosed with autism when I was 2, anger issues at 4, depression at 16, and I was frequently in and out of school for behavioural problems. I do not bring this up because I have a particularly bad life. In fact, I consider myself rather blessed. This simply means that when I was transferred to a special school, I was surrounded by people who had lives much worse than mine, who did not and still do not have a light at the end of their tunnel. So, in practice, what I went to was not actually a special school, but I left it as is for my Reddit post for simplicity's sake. You know, it was a special school and it wasn't a special school. It's complicated, but, you know, whatever. The fact that genuinely important problems, like whether the problems blighting these people can be solved with genomic editing, is overlooked because the subject is not politically correct, is inexcusable when it harms the poor these people claim to care about. This is not to say that the bell curve does not have its problems. Its stance on race and IQ was and still is highly controversial, but that does not mean we should throw the baby out with the bathwater with regards to the serious questions they raise which are not being sufficiently tackled. Now that researchers at the University of Sydney have made breakthroughs with seq-RNA, overcoming many of the limitations of CRISPR editing, we may be in a situation where genetic markers of inequality may be curable, and genetic contributors of inequality are a thing of the past. The main thing stopping us from achieving this equality is red tape, not an inability to make scientific progress. I am therefore looking to get a message out there that we as a society need to be honest about the true causes of inequality in the West and whether liberalising the incredibly strict laws on genetic engineering worldwide, especially germline genetic editing, is the best way to solve this problem. What do you people think? Do you see a flaw in my reasoning, or something I have not considered which I should have? By the way, I will be posting this on other groups to get different perspectives, so do not be surprised if you see this written elsewhere. And cheers in advance. First response. The single largest determinant of IQ is geography, which is why it's generally not used anymore. If you're basing your paper around it, I would make double sure the research is actually supporting your thesis. You will naturally find data to support your conclusion, so you must seek out data that contradicts it, otherwise you're just falling into cognitive bias. OP response. The single largest determinant of IQ is geography. This is true. However, the main reason is simply because if you grow up in North Korea, you are not getting the nutrients your brain needs to grow. My argument is that once you control for that, looking solely amongst people who live in Western societies, for instance, the biggest predictor of life success is genetics. This is not my opinion, there is good research on the subject. I would argue that the conclusion is more accurately who your parents are rather than genetics. Have you looked into the stats on identical twins who are raised separately? Also, since you're willing to do the work, you should define in your paper what you mean by IQ. IQ tests are only semi-standardised and have been changed at various periods. Make sure you're accounting for the time period your cited studies were performed in, which I do not do in my pitch, so I will do it here for the viewers. Obviously, IQ is the construct which is measured in IQ tests, but you really need to know what an IQ test is in order to conceptualise what this means. In essence, Charles Spearman discovered almost 100 years ago that people who did well on one cognitive test generally did well on all other cognitive tests, whether they be mathematical, musical, verbal, quantitative, working memory, general knowledge, or anything. The underlying construct of this cognitive efficiency is what he called G, or general intelligence, and IQ is the score that is an estimate of a person's G. That is what I am referring to when I talk about IQ. Second response. Let us suppose that the current social hierarchy is indeed organised along genetic lines. If gene engineering becomes available, wouldn't those at the top of the hierarchy, those with the money to afford gene editing, be able to ensure even better genes for their offspring, whilst those at the bottom would be excluded? That would happen initially, but if there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that genetic engineering can improve the quality of lives for the upper classes, why would there not be a grassroots movement to provide that opportunity to the poor? For instance, in the UK, it costs around £10,000 Great British pounds per year per child to be educated at a public school. If I am at school until I am 21, pursuing an undergraduate degree, then the government is spending approximately £200,000 on my education. This is a mistake on my part, as the UK does not have a free university, but rising tuition fees are a contentious issue, so the overall point still stands. Richard Heyer at UC Irvine has pointed out that people in the top 1% of mathematical ability can, at the age of 13, be put into a class at Johns Hopkins University and keep up with the rest of their class, meaning it is possible for a person who is genetically engineered to finish with an undergraduate degree at the age of about 16. Exceptionally talented people have been known to get PhDs at the age of 14, so let's say that being edited means that I can shave 8 years off my schooling. That saves the government 80,000 Great British pounds, about 125,000 US dollars, per student that gets genetically engineered. This is not including reduced hospital spending, mental health benefits, quality of life benefits, the improved economic productivity, or anything else that would result from widespread genetic engineering. Considering this, would it not be in the government's interest to implement a program that makes GGE available to as many people as possible, provided they act within the Nuffield bioethics guidelines or some equivalent and provide willing and informed consent? It's worth touching upon what exactly is meant by improved economic efficiency. To give one example to help you conceptualise, the Ashkenazi Jewish population have an IQ approximately 15 points higher than the average non-Jewish Westerner. This does not mean much for the general population. However, it means that when you look at the tails of the distribution, there is a walloping overrepresentation of Jewish geniuses. There is something like 3 times the number of Jewish Nobel Prize winners, for instance, which means in principle if you could raise everyone's IQ by an equivalent amount, there would be 3 times the number of exceptionally productive scientists that emerge from all racial categories. That means 3 times the likelihood of finding a cure for cancer, 3 times the likelihood of solving climate and environmental crises, 3 times the likelihood of preventing the next pandemic, 3 times the likelihood of inventing a radically life-altering technology that saves millions of people from poverty, etc. Now imagine if we can increase average IQ by 3 or 4 standard deviations. What would happen to scientific progress? Third response. I disagree with much of your third and fourth paragraphs. There's no definition of life success. Conscientiousness can be just as much nature as nurture. I do somewhat agree school environment and surrounding social environment can be important factors in a life's future, but aren't environmental factors nurture? Time and time again, IQ alone has been shown to be a poor predictor of happiness, social success, and general quality of life. OP response. Time and time again. That is not true. The main reason I cited the bell curve is because IQ is the single biggest predictor of social success. If you've applied for internships, you will have had to do problem-solving tests that test your cognitive ability. Why would they do that if IQ doesn't predict life success? If you want to get into a university in the US, you have to do an SAT. The SAT is also referred to as a general cognitive ability assessment, i.e. an IQ test, originally designed so that the Labour Party in the UK could identify the, quote, deserving poor and help them up the socio-economic ladder. Unless you want to argue that people who do not go to university have the same social success as a person who got into Harvard, the argument falls apart. IQ also correlates with physical fitness, how physically attractive you are to the opposite sex, mortality, job performance, job satisfaction, and other markers of social success and quality of life. As to there being no definition of life success, if you had a child, would you want them to fail school, be completely incapable of getting a job, unloved by the world, and eventually die of a suicidal overdose at the age of 30? Or would you want them to be top of the class with a full scholarship to a top university, a successful career, exceptional health, exceptional fitness, and the sort of person everyone wants to be friends with? The mere fact that there are individual differences in how people define success does not mean there are not commonalities. Addressing the point that conscientiousness can be as much nurture as nature, that's debatable. We can actually measure this by using twin and adoption studies. Monozygotic twins share 100% of their genetic material, and dizygotic twins share 50% of their genetic material. So, if you double the differences between a group of MZ and DZ twins, it gives a viable estimate for how much of whatever variable you are measuring is genetic amongst people with no relationship to each other. This can then be fact-checked by adoption studies, which also allow researchers to control genetic and environmental factors, essentially separating out nature and nurture. Robert Plomin at King's College London is one of the leading figures in this field as it applies to behavioural genetics, and he just wrote a book called Blueprint as to how the single biggest predictor of numerous traits, including conscientiousness, is genetics. Poster's response. Very few job applications or internships are decided by IQ testing alone or even in large measure. As far back as the 1980s, hiring and appointing mechanisms began to see social incorporation as preferential to events like going postal, yet they still occur. How are such things possible or predictable? Not every single thing can be known about a given conception and gestation of a single fetus, twin, or more fetuses. A close examination of every base pair may or may not reveal a transcriptional or translational difference between a shared or sibling pregnancy. In a shared pregnancy, is each placenta equally equal, or every external sound received totally identical by each, whether upright or inverted or amniotic fluid acoustically differentiated by time or space? How ideally and in what order do single or multiple births occur? I wouldn't disagree a child raised in a home rich with nutrition, love, and the arts could have a higher IQ or SAT scores than another, but not guaranteed. Too often I've seen children of low or modest income environments excel beyond assumption or prediction for reasons of nature, nurture, or chance. OP response. Very few job applications or internships are decided by IQ testing alone or even in large measure. Alone, that's true. In large part, that's debatable. Even if there are not explicit measures for IQ tests, how many companies prefer to hire someone at Yale than someone who went to a community college? Given this fact, what is the biggest predictor of getting into Yale? I'm citing this as an example, but in practice you have to take a bird's eye view to make sure many things like this are considered, not just for IQ but with confounding variables like SES, personality factors, etc., and see all the areas of life that are impacted by all of these variables both collectively and individually, and model that with your statistical tests. The psychologists who've done this, like the ones I've cited, have pointed to IQ being the single biggest predictor of success. That does not mean IQ is all you need for success, or that people can't have a high IQ and a poor quality of life and vice versa, but it does mean it is an important issue that needs to be greatly considered. A close examination of every base pair may or may not reveal a transcriptional or translational difference between a shared or sibling pregnancy. Possibly, but if we have a trait where there is overwhelming evidence that more of this trait is good, then why wouldn't we just edit that trait/traits to maximise the chance of giving the child a high quality life and leave everything else to chance? Too often I've seen children of low or modest income environments excel beyond assumption or prediction for reasons of nature, nurture, or chance. By definition, something must be causing this. I'm not saying there are not people who rise above expectations, but by definition, those are the exceptions. We cannot use them as pseudo-evidence to turn a blind eye to the sufferings of the majority. So this person responded to multiple posts, however I've only included the one that I am responding to. It's controversial because it's bullshit, false, incorrect, etc. IQ, which is mostly genetic, is a bigger predictor of life success than any other variable. So make society less unfair. I'm sure that statistical correlation is true, but it doesn't mean high IQ is good. It means we've got a society in which life success is measured by metric forced upon everyone else. And let's cut to it, it's how much you can make the rich richer. Anyway, for real, you should go learn why people think IQ is not so meaningful. OP response. Hello. I will not respond to all of your points, mostly because I have addressed them elsewhere, but for the controversy surrounding the bell curve, I am aware why people do not like it. So make society less unfair. There is evidence of people pushing for this in the New Testament, written 2,000 years ago. What makes you think liberalising GGE laws are easier than making society, quote, less unfair? People can still feel discriminated against even if things like bullying and unfair workplace discrimination are gotten rid of. For example, if I have bad cerebral palsy, I'm not going to be very attractive to women, and that means I'm more likely to feel lonely due to not having a soulmate. So should we create laws that force all women to go out with men that they don't find attractive? If we do not, then we are creating a society where people feel left out simply because they are different. This is just one example of why, quote, make society less unfair is a very difficult thing to define, let alone accomplish. Anyway, for real, you should go learn why people think IQ is not so meaningful. I know why people think IQ research isn't meaningful, but I'm not convinced by the argument. For instance, one of the largest critics of IQ research is a woman named Angela Duckworth. She wrote a book called Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance, where she makes the case that grit, what is essentially trait conscientiousness on the Big Five personality model, is a larger predictor of success than IQ. The first chapter on this uses West Point as her example for academic success. Now, call me cynical, but the epitome of academic success, specifically in America, would probably be gaining acceptance and performing well at the Ivy League universities. Being a university professor at UPenn, with degrees from Harvard and Oxford, I would have thought that measuring success amongst Ivy League students would have been easy. So why is she choosing a military college for her example, one that, by the way, I had to look up? Could it be that in order to get into an Ivy League university, you need to have a high SAT score, and because there is a very strong literature pointing out that SAT success is highly correlated with IQ? That would certainly be a stone in the shoe of her argument, as no one makes the argument that people who fail high school have the same standard of living as those with a full scholarship to Harvard. It also overlooks the fact that much of trait conscientiousness also has a genetic component, as evidenced in Catherine Page Harden's The Genetic Lottery. This is not to say I do not sympathise with people who want IQ to be meaningless. IQ literature is very depressing, and indeed one of my arguments was simply that Herrnstein and Murray in the bell curve concluded what they did about race and IQ simply because, well, all of these other depressing facts turned out to be true, so why wouldn't this one? You can agree or disagree with that stance if you want, but if you actually read the bell curve, at least I got the sense that the main reason it was persecuted is simply because accepting that what they have to say is true paints a very negative picture of the world. That's partly why I'm making the connection between IQ and genetic engineering, because if people are anti-GGE simply because they do not know how bad the real world is, then this is a message that desperately needs a wider audience.
Yeah, in the United States we have about 330 million people, and because of the distribution, the relatively normal distribution of IQ scores, about 16% have IQs of 85 or less.
Right.
Which means they're not going to graduate school.
No, it means that from what I've read practically, it means the Wonderlit company has actually done they have a nice IQ test from the commercial perspective. It's actually psychometrically valid. And they've linked IQ levels to job, specifically to job categories,
Yes, I know. What I was going to say is they're not only not going to graduate school, they're not going to find a stable job that pays a livable wage.
Yeah. Now, especially even given that so many of the service jobs now require a fair high degree of computational savvy, or not computational, but ability to interact with complex computational technology. Even the typical till at a checkout market or the till at a McDonald's, because McDonald's is actually very complicated, is often far beyond the ability of people who are on the low end of the intelligence distribution.
So I was going to say that in the United States, this bottom 16% translates into 51 million people,
right,
including 13 million children who are in school.
Right.
This is a very difficult problem. Now, I knew Earl Hunt. He passed away last year. Knew him pretty well. He also would say that there is this cognitive segregation in society. This is a point that Charles Murray makes.
Yeah.
Well, and Earl would often ask, when's the last time you had someone over for dinner who wasn't a college graduate?
Yeah. Well, that was something that Murray and Herrnstein wrote about in their book, The Bell Curve, which really struck me, because I read that book twice, unlike most of the people who criticized it.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that they pointed out in there was, look, the typical educated person thinks that someone isn't very bright if they have an IQ of 115. So we're talking about the graduate level and PhD level research institutions, right? Because 115... There's as many people at 115 above as there are at 85 and below. And so it's a minority of the population, and that's the top 15%. And, that's the duller undergraduate.
Right.
So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've dealt with people who had ranges in the low 80s and tried to find them jobs and tried to train them. And I have some real knowledge about the stunning gap between people at the low end of the IQ distribution and the high end. And it's no bloody wonder people hate IQ research and intelligence research, because it reveals a set of seriously dismal facts about the incredible range of ability among human beings.
Well, yes, this is true. And moreover, I would add to this that people in universities, professors and graduate students, have a hard time understanding what everyday life is like if you have an IQ of 80 or 85. And you're making your way, you're living independently, you're making your way in the world. But it is a challenge. It is
challenge. It just barely begins to describe it. I had a client who, he probably had an IQ of under 80, the nonverbal portion of it, anyways, and he was indistinguishable in physical appearance from let's say, I hate to use the phrase normal person, but there's nothing that marked him out about particularly intellectually impaired, and. I tried at one point. This was so telling to me. I got him a volunteer job, which, by the way, is very difficult. It's harder to get a volunteer job than a real job, because you have to do police screening and all sorts of things, and the selection process is just as extreme. But I eventually ended up getting him a job at a bike bookstore, but that place couldn't hold him once the subsidy program had expired. And then I got him a job at a charity. And his job was to fold letters into 3 so that they could be put into envelopes. Well, that sounds easy, except that he also had a bit of a motor tremor. And, it took me about 30 hours to train him to fold up a piece of paper with sufficient precision so that it could be put in an envelope rapidly, so that the envelope wasn't so mangled that it would get stuck in the automatic sorting machine. And, there was high performance demands on him, too. He had to whip through those letters pretty quickly. And then sometimes the letters would have a photograph appended to them that was stapled on. And they weren't always stapled on in the same place. So then he had to calculate how to fold the paper over the photograph without bending the photograph in precise thirds so that it would still fit in the envelope. And then he had to separate the French letters from the English letters and associate them with the proper envelopes. And that level of complexity just did him in.
To go into the other points brought up by Ducksworth and people like her would take forever, but hopefully this gives you a sense of why I'm sceptical that IQ is meaningless, and why I'm more convinced to believe the Richard Heyer and Stuart Ritchie arguments that IQ is a bigger predictor of success than trait conscientiousness. Another argument is that race is a social construct, and that is also something I do not buy. I am working on building connections in China, for example, as they do not have the history of eugenics that we have in the West, and are therefore more nuanced with their stance on GGE. I can confirm that Asian people do not look different from Europeans because they wake up in the morning and paint themselves over. I do not understand why this argument is so popular. The people from the Han Chinese population are completely incapable of living at the altitudes of the mountainous peoples that separated from the Han population around 10,000 years ago. So why would there not be evolutionary differences between populations living in areas as radically different as Russia and Africa after hundreds of thousands of years? This is not to say that biological differences should be used for discriminatory purposes. I think the evidence is overwhelming that that does not work. What I am saying is that things like higher concentrations of melanin being linked to mutations of the TYR genes is a biological, not an environmental mutation, and similar things have been found for bone structure, gait, fat-to-muscle ratio, the concentrations of certain hormones, etc. As for your stance on North Korea, yes, there is good evidence to suggest that not getting the nutrients needed correlates with brain performance. Many of the top charities on GiveWell, i.e. the most high-performing charities in the world, work because they found that killing pathogens that suck nutrients away from children in sub-Saharan Africa, like guinea worm for instance, leads to a higher increase in school grades than funding school resources. The only alternative stance I've heard is that Africa has a lower average IQ for racialist reasons, and I personally am more convinced of the former argument. Final response on r/ethics. For context, my experience is in academic writing, biotech first, and bioethics second. I think that, before you can begin discussing potential flaws in your ethical reasoning, you need to first discuss flaws in the basis of that reasoning. Can't build a house on top of a foundation made of quicksand, you know? In this regard, I saw two main issues: arguments being used to argue, and a misguided understanding of both how reason operates within research and, in turn, how one must operate within research in order to reason. Don't take this the wrong way, but I'm not exactly sure what you're trying to argue here. You just posit so much in the original post, at least a dozen claims that could be their own entirely separate pieces. I think maybe you've taken some of these to be fact and intended for them to evidence your desired claim. In the most constructive way possible, your piece holds no weight this way. It's like building a skyscraper out of straw and then making the top floor steel. I strongly encourage you to read publications from the Hastings Centre report to get a feel for the structure and methodology of published ethics literature. And don't worry, not everything they publish is boring scholarly yapping lol. In its most useful definition, science is effectively a set of rules that act as an incredibly useful, powerful tool for getting closer to the truth. Its ability to do just that hinges on an adherence to those rules. That extends to writing about science, in any real argumentative capacity at least. So, if you want to engage with anyone who has relevant experience beyond a first year of undergraduate, there are a couple of specifics you should address. 1. There are no absolutes in science, so for no reason should you use absolutes when discussing findings. This isn't just a semantic formality, it's a logical fallacy. 2. Why on earth would you cite what's probably one of the most infamously discredited publications of all time? You're shooting yourself in the foot. 3. Your metrics are too abstract. For example, how did you define life success? Like we established earlier, experimental conclusions aren't immaculate truth, but good conclusions are a strong indicator of the truth, and you still need solid empirical grounds to suggest that indication exists. Again, you'd benefit from some more exposure to academic writing. As a bit of an aside, you also have to adhere to specific conventions and procedures outside of the actual research if you want your work to have much integrity, as these specifics act as standards for credibility. For example, if the authors of a piece about their new regression analysis cared about its credibility, they would first publish in an academic journal so that the work could be reviewed at length by relevant experts and then publish a book. Suffice to say, Murray and Herrnstein did not do this. This is far from their only empirical sin, but listing them all would be its own book. I hope this doesn't come across as mean because that's not my intention. This is all written to be as constructive as possible. With that hopefully established, a parting thought: Beauchamp and Childress paraphrase Aristotle in Principles of Biomedical Ethics. We can only expect the precision and degree of certainty appropriate to the subject matter. Sometimes answers cannot be as tidy as we might wish. Cheers. OP. Hello. Thank you very much for responding constructively. It's not often that this happens. You've written a lot, so I apologise if it appears I'm glossing over, and feel free to get me to respond to something if you feel it needs more detail. You are right. There are no absolutes in science. However, there are very strong probabilities that when combined with logical arguments can be treated as absolutes. My argument is that IQ having a strong correlation with life success is one of those such arguments. For instance, you elsewhere state that, I think you may have taken some of these to be fact and intended for them to evidence your desired claim. It is a fact that IQ correlates with quality of life on numerous metrics. Again, I would recommend Richard Hayer's work on this subject. It is also a fact that much of this is biological, not just for IQ, but for other traits which impact quality of life. And again, I would recommend Robert Plomin and Catherine Page Hayden, two people who strongly disagree with each other. And it is also true that if you minimize environmental differences between people, then you maximize biological differences, which means if there is a biological element of inequality, which there is, then that becomes the biggest determinant of life outcomes if only social causes of poverty are addressed. Herrnstein and Murray made this claim almost 30 years ago, and I came to this independently just by connecting the dots that no one else wanted to connect. I therefore do not see the flaw in these arguments. Point 2. The main reason I am citing the bell curve is because I do not think the reasons it was discredited were justifiable. Essentially, the bell curve is hated because the subject wasn't politically correct, and most of the, quote, debunks use arguments like race is a social construct, or IQ is not something that can be proved, which no serious researcher in these subjects takes seriously. I think that the main reason it was hated on was because it pointed to something no one wanted to be true, and the fact that the arguments hold up well when you analyse them critically in spite of this is partly why I'm so convinced of the conclusions. Point 3. Life success is actually not that difficult to define. If you had a child, you would probably want the best for that child, and whilst there might be some debate as to what that might look like in detail, e.g. do you want the child to be a top-tier athlete, there are good arguments for and against this, there are other aspects of life success which parents clearly want for their children: a good job, good friends, good relationships with their family members and spouse, good physical and mental health, no drug problems, etc. Quantifying this into metrics for quality of life is not as hard as people often make it out to be, and psychometricians do it literally all the time. I've kept my definition vague simply because, as the post says, this is a pitch, but in practice, life success and quality of life is not something researchers struggle to aim at. Having said that, I will look up your reading recommendations. I have read a sufficient amount of academic works, but I'm only 20, so it's unlikely to be a PhD level amount of depth, and I understand that my work could always be improved. Although, I will say that most people have generally been happy with my style of academic writing, and it's only once I talk about inflammatory subjects like this that the daggers start flying. Those were the responses on r/ethics. Now I am moving to r/genetics. First response. So much of what you've written is untrue. But as far as I can tell, the only reason this topic hasn't been breached is simply because of how controversial it is. No, this topic has been debated at large, and eugenics was the government policy of many countries in the 20th century. Herrnstein and Murray point out back in 1995 that IQ, which is mostly genetic, IQ is a heritable trait, but it is not mostly genetic. Like all complex traits, there is a large environmental component. Things like childhood nutrition and access to education improve IQ scores. Catherine Page Harden has written a book called The Genetic Lottery, which makes a strong case that inherent biological programming is the single biggest predictor of where you are in the social ladder. I've read this book. That isn't what it says. A gifted student who gets a full scholarship to Harvard and then a six-figure salary at Facebook, as an example. This implies that the bell curve is a good predictor of where you end up. How many, quote, gifted people are never even presented the option of applying to Harvard? The main thing stopping us from achieving this equality is red tape, not an inability to make scientific progress. You make it sound as if genome editing is some straightforward panacea that could fix any genetic disease. What if there are off-target effects that have severe medical consequences? Overall, the reason that eugenics has been abandoned as a concept is that it's impossible for us as a society to determine what is, quote, good genetically, and eugenics was only ever used to inflict suffering on marginalised groups without providing any benefits to society at large. OP. Hello. Thank you for your response. I want to emphasise from the beginning that I am not responding in bad faith, but simply giving my comebacks against your stance. I apologise in advance if I have offended you. No, this topic has been debated at large, and eugenics was the government policy of many countries in the 20th century. I am not making a case for eugenics. I am making a case for germline genetic editing. They are not the same thing. There is a difference between a parent trying to make sure their child does not die of muscular dystrophy and anything that was done in Nazi Germany. I am simply making the case that extends to more than just single gene disorders. Industry veterans like Jennifer Doudna has pointed this out in her book, A Cracking Creation, and there are many papers from bioethicists who conclude the same thing, albeit in a health, not an IQ context. IQ is a heritable trait, but it is not, quote, mostly genetic. Yes, it is. That is why environmental interventions like Head Start have limited success. It is also why academics like Stuart Ritchie and Scott Kaufman can prove that IQ predicts something like 25% of success, whereas conscientiousness predicts only 15%. If your stance is that how many gifted people are never even presented the option of applying to Harvard, I could equally point out that there are many people who work hard and are not rewarded for it. That is why we do large-scale statistical analysis to find out what the best predictors are, all things considered, and the vast majority of reliable research says the top predictor is IQ. That is what the topic of the bell curve is about, although it is discussed in books other than the bell curve. I've read this book. That isn't what she says. Yes, it is. She points out at the very start, for instance, that education is the single biggest predictor of a person's success, a large predictor of my mistake on my part, and that the rise in the standard of living in America since the 1960s is only true for those who are university educated. I also cited Plomin in his research, who explicitly says that genetics is the single biggest predictor for educational attainment, as well as numerous other things. I cannot go into detail without this subject being an essay, but the gist is that genetics is definitely a large, if not the single biggest predictor of inequality, and if this is not addressed, then the genetic caste system is definitely a risk. This implies that the bell curve is a good predictor of where you end up. It is. The US military, for instance, will not hire anyone if they have an IQ below 80. That is 10% of the population. The reason being is because it costs too much to train them up compared to people at the other end of the spectrum. This is not just for infantry roles, but the army also hires people for trade-based, supply logistics, and other non-fighting roles. Whilst there may not be the same immediate barriers that are IQ-related for civilian professions, if it takes longer to train you than another person for a job, you can imagine employment being a bit of a struggle. Look up Mark Molly explaining life with an IQ of 70 on YouTube. Any clinical psychologist who has worked with people on the low end of the intellectual scale will say this is a typical experience, and also you can work in the most low level of jobs. This is a stark contrast to the AI guys working for Elon and Zuckerberg, both smart and who really know how to use technology, who are performing large amounts of work extremely efficiently. You make it sound as if genome editing is some straightforward panacea that could fix any genetic disease. What if there are off-target effects that have severe medical consequences? I understand that genetic engineering is complicated. Do not get me wrong. However, the rules on it are super strict. In Australia, where I currently reside, it is illegal to do genetic editing on embryos even if that embryo will go up to be a child with a serious life-threatening condition, e.g. Tay-Sachs disease. The reason, according to the UN, is because we need to regulate genetic engineering because of, quote, potential consequences on future generations. Now, call me cynical, but surely if the child is going to die a slow and painful death, then the, quote, potential consequences are probably not going to be worse than doing nothing. I mean, after all, if the child dies, that also impacts future generations. If the first trials are a success, we can study the consequences of genetic engineering on this population as a whole to get a better idea of what the, quote, potential consequences are. Then maybe we can look at other disorders like PKU or cystic fibrosis. Then maybe we can look at disorders that have more than one faulty gene, for instance, xeroderma pigmentosum or cerebral palsy. Then maybe we can look at disorders that affect quality of life, things like major depression rather than mortality. Then maybe we can look at moderate depression and slowly expand out the possibilities as our understanding of GGE gets more sophisticated. This is just a hypothetical, but it's worth pointing out for argument's sake. Even if it means that the IQ problem will not be solved in the next few decades, it at least means that there is the possibility of solving the issue in the future with a fail-safe in case there do end up being potential consequences. That's my final takeaway. I'm not doing this with evil intentions in mind. I'm doing this because I genuinely think it is the right thing to do. I know it is controversial, but controversial does not necessarily mean wrong. There may be ways in which it could be misused, but that just means the field needs to be regulated, not outright banned. Anyways, I do appreciate your input, whatever that's worth. Second response. This is eugenics, and it won't solve inequality because people would invent new reasons to think of certain groups as other. Also, there are many more factors to success than IQ, like emotional intelligence, wit, resilience, self-esteem, etc. Sub-response. Will inequality ever be solved? There will always be inequality based on initiative and innate traits. OP. You're right, inequality will never be solved. But if inequality is fundamentally genetic, and there is no way of changing a person's genes, then there is nothing a person can do to change it. GGE at least means that people who have suffered miserably do not have to pass that lifestyle on to their children. As to my stance being eugenic, no, it is not. There is a world of difference between a parent who wants to remove traits from their bloodline so their children can live an exceptionally high quality life and anything that was done in Nazi Germany. Eugenics is about intent, and I do not have the intent of forcing people into GGE if they disagree with me. I just want my children to live exceptionally high quality lives, and I don't want people saying I cannot pursue this for reasons that fall apart under scrutiny. Third response. If you create a society where everyone has the best possible genetic outcomes, all you've done is skew the bell curve to one extreme. OP. True, but for something like IQ, where there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that more is better, what exactly is the problem? Fourth response. Firstly, special ed isn't the other end of the bell curve than giftedness. There are people who are both gifted and have special education needs. For example, I'm gifted and autistic. Most of the criteria for autism has nothing to do with IQ. Secondly, genetics is complicated. Lots of genes do multiple things. Keeping on the topic of autism, there's actually some evidence that autistic people are more likely to be at either extreme of IQ, and that visuospatial giftedness is overrepresented in families of autistic probands, even when the proband themselves has a low IQ. So selecting for higher intelligence could increase the rate of autism. Another example is 5-HTT-PLR. There's two common alleles in the general population, one linked to increased risk of depression, the other to an increased risk of psychopathy, so there's no clear optimal choice there. Thirdly, who gets to say what's best? Just because it seems obvious to you that autism is a bad thing doesn't mean everyone agrees. Personally, I like being autistic and I hope my daughter is autistic too. There are people who have said that they'd rather have a deaf child than a hearing child, or that they prefer it if their child had a dwarfism condition. What gives you the right to dictate whether or not they should get their wish? And you might say it should be obvious that having a disability is a bad thing, but that's just because you haven't figured out just how subjective the line between disability and difference is, and how arbitrary our standards of normal are. For example, compared to dogs, we're disabled in our sense of smell. If we figured out gene therapy to give a human the smell acuity of the average dog, should we? Or if you bring up norms, consider that you're proposing changing those norms. What's average intelligence now, if you get your wish, could become intellectually disabled in the future as our standards change. IQ scores will literally go down for older people if intelligence goes up, because IQ tests are normed on the general population with an average of 100. This is actually happening already, by the way. Research the Flynn effect. Societal standards make a difference too. In Martha's Vineyard in the 1800s, deafness didn't impair communication because the rate of genetic deafness was so high, in some places as high as 1 in 25, that everyone learned to sign. Deaf children were born into a community that already had fluent signing, and therefore had no language delays. Sadly, this culture died out as people started sending deaf kids away to boarding schools. But if we all decided to learn sign language and teach our kids, deafness would once again cause only minimal impairment. Similarly, mildly autistic people often go in and out of meeting impairment criteria based on their societal circumstances, impaired in K-12, fine in university, and then impaired again in the workforce. Fourthly, how would you enforce this? If you make IQ-boosting gene therapy available but don't make people use it, then you create greater inequality between people who did or didn't get the therapy in infancy. If you do force it on people, you're infringing on people's freedoms and likely going to have a bunch of human rights abuses in the process. OP. First point. That is true. You can be gifted and autistic. However, Temple Grandin wrote a book on the autistic brain and points out that mathematical intelligence is the same amongst people with autism as people without, and verbal intelligence is on average lower. There is a high proportion of savants amongst the autistic community, but even then it is only 10%. That means 90% of people with autism have all of the downsides and none of the upsides. If you are an exception, then that is great, but it does not detract from the general trend. To your second point, there is some debate amongst high-functioning autism and possible exceptions to the IQ correlations. However, high-functioning autism is the autism that causes the least amount of problems. I have high-functioning autism. I do not feel like my torso was on fire if I put on a woolly jumper, even though I have preferences for certain types of materials. Mid to low-functioning autism is where the serious problems lie, and that is something which does not correlate with IQ. I do not disagree that there are people with autism who have high-quality lives. I myself am blessed compared to some of the people I went to school with. The bit I'm worried about is that the people I went to school with are rapidly becoming the sorts of people at the bottom of the social ladder, and they aren't blessed in the same way I am. If the reason they are there is because of what is essentially genetic determinism, I have a problem with that not being addressed simply because the issue is not politically correct. One of the reasons I have no problems with modifying IQ is because it does not just correlate with academic performance. People with higher IQs are on average healthier, happier, and have higher quality lives. It really does seem to be that there is nothing but benefits to having a high IQ, so whilst I do agree that caution should be used when GGE is pursued, I do not think there is any evidence that meddling with IQ, when done properly, has negative consequences. Although I should mention this should be investigated. We will not know for sure unless we have HPE technologies and perform it on at least animal studies. However, that is essentially what I am arguing for. To your third and fourth points, if you have no problem being autistic, then that is fine with me. It is true that there are psychiatric disorders that people often debate to what extent are disorders. I once again emphasise that this depends a lot on what type of autism you have, but you are right that there is at least debate around the subject. For spina bifida, as an alternative example, no one argues that that is good. Find me one person who thinks that SB has improved their quality of life. I am focusing on IQ, however, where there is clear evidence that quality of life and IQ go hand in hand, as demonstrated in the sources I cited. I have no ethical problems with providing my children with higher IQs, provided the technology is up to the task, and the fact that red tape is the fundamental problem with developing the technology is something I do not think is getting enough attention. Addressing the fourth point more specifically, yes, not everyone will agree to being genetically engineered, but if that is their choice, then that is their choice. I am not arguing that everyone should be a, quote, genetic superior as presented in the film Gattaca. I just want an option to be in place so that if I lose the genetic lottery and am doomed to a low quality of life, e.g. a person with major depression, then I am not doomed to passing that on to my children, e.g. many people with major depression will not have children because they are worried their children will have equally miserable lives. As the world gets more complex, the same thing is bound to happen with IQ. If you do not want to genetically engineer your children, then that is fine with me, but then you have no right to determine that I cannot genetically engineer mine provided I am operating within reasonable regulations. Having established this, I do appreciate your response. I understand Reddit threads can get toxic, especially on such controversial subjects, so I appreciate you coming across as reasonable. Poster's response. Inequality is not fundamentally genetic. It comes from social emphasis on differences, be they genetic in their source or not, and mostly are not, and judging some state for a better trait to be better than another. It is not straightforward what's the best for everyone, everywhere, always. Genetic editing requires a strong grasp of the architecture of the traits it, quote, corrects, and I fear we are nowhere near to such a case. The program aiming to detect causal variance has a long way to walk and, even if it were to reconstruct a comprehensive network of genotype times phenotype associations, applying the, quote, editing may not be easy or feasible, possible, or all there together. It's easy to overestimate what medical technology can do. It may be that the trait you're aiming to, quote, correct is as heritable as it is affected by the environment, or it may not be a trait we may want to correct. I know little about the genetics of IQ, but I doubt about its penetrance amongst those who have variants that drive it higher. The trait may even capture only a side of the source of inequality. As for strongly debilitating diseases, again, we may not know well how they are driven genetically and environmentally. And even after the genetic part has been, quote, fixed, environment remains something to be, quote, fixed. More in general, think about people who have the genetic of a trait fixed but their environment still drives the phenotype to the inequality one. It's their fault. Should they be helped out of it? A second problem would be to translate such a hypothetical scientific advancement into a policy. Science, technology, and policy making do not walk at the same pace, and those who write laws must account for as many scenarios in which they may be applied. It's auspicable that new policies go towards reducing inequalities, but it may not be so, either for overlooking consequences or group interest. If genome editing was such a panacea, scientific/technological premise, how could it be made available to everyone? Must it be forced on everyone? See, some parents with a genetic disease that do not want to edit their offspring. How to ensure that these kids won't be subject to inequality? Should they be protected from inequality? It was their choice. Policymakers have to make such cases not possible, and this is not a scientific or technological problem. It may be an even harsher problem as it entails other policies, e.g. strong welfare state, and an intent to do so. Like genetic editing may not be feasible for messy complex traits which are associated with other ones, you correct a causal variant that regulate two traits in opposite directions, implementing it as a policy may not lead to what the policymaker was aiming at. OP. Hello. Thank you for your response. Even if you assume inequality is not fundamentally genetic now, there is the problem of what happens if it is at least partly genetic, which it definitely is, and what happens if we invest in social measures to remove social inequality and nothing more. It's true that inequality is only partly driven by IQ, although it's not as small as people think, but even if you assume it is small, it's almost certainly going to grow with time. This part of the argument is not controversial. Any high school biology student is taught that there are biological and environmental factors that affect an organism's outcome, putting aside philosophical controversy surrounding free will and consciousness. If you remove environmental differences between organisms, like through government interventions, then you maximise the genetic inequalities. How does this not lead to a genetic caste system? Genome editing requires a strong grasp of the architecture of the traits it, quote, corrects, and I fear we are nowhere near to such a case. I agree, but that does not mean we cannot make it so in the future. There is an article in Nature published by Peter Vischer, Loic Yengo, Christopher Gingell, and Julian Savulescu, pointing out that this may be viable in as little as 30 years. This is an estimate, of course, and they themselves notice this, but what I am worried about is the bureaucracy stemming from this being so controversial is going to prolong this development further, rather than regulating the field so that we can maximise the good and minimise the bad. I am not arguing that this is complex for science, I am arguing that this is a moral thing to be aiming for. That justifies aiming for it in spite of its complexity. It's their fault. Should they be helped out of it? I'm not against environmental interventions, and I agree that environmental and genetic interventions should be used in unison with each other. I am worried about the overemphasis on environment due to the controversy of genetic interventions. As for strongly debilitating diseases, my proposition, and the proposition in the Nature article, is that we start small. Let's say something like Tay-Sachs disease, where there is clearly a moral imperative for GGE. I've explained elsewhere, but basically Tay-Sachs disease causes children to die at the age of 5 and is clearly due to one faulty gene, no environmental impact. If this works, maybe we can look at other single gene disorders. If that works, maybe we can look at disorders with more than one single gene mutation. If that works, we could look at disorders that impact quality of life instead of mortality, e.g. major depression. If that works, we can look at less serious disorders which are still serious, e.g. moderate depression. I'm not saying we should just jump straight into the deep end. I'm saying that if we have a pathway like this, then we have the data to establish whether extending this into enhancement, e.g. not just removing obesity, but actively promoting higher quality lives from a GGE perspective, is a sensible thing to do. We do not have the technology for jumping into the deep end anyways, so let's gradually build up over time so we can maximise the benefits and minimise the cost. Science, technology and policy making do not walk at the same pace. I know, that is the point of my argument, that the law should be keeping up with the science. I have posted this on Reddit to see if people can think of counter-arguments that I may have missed, but as far as I can tell, the ethics is very much in support of GGE, and it's people's aversion to it that's getting in the way. Must it be forced on everyone? No, I never made the argument it should. I want the ability to edit my children because I don't like the fact there is a glass ceiling on how high quality my life is, simply because I have an inherent tilt towards depression, and because I wasn't born with an IQ of 160. I don't want my children to have to deal with the same consequences. If you disagree, don't edit your kids. Doesn't affect me. All I ask is that you don't force me not to edit my kids because you don't know anything about what the right thing is in my situation. Implementing it as a policy may not lead to what the policymakers were aiming at. I am asking for parent choice. The general rule dating back to John Stuart Mill is that if you have complex ethical issues that are difficult to codify into laws, then providing as much individual autonomy, within reason, is what does the most amount of good, all things considered. I do not see why genetic engineering is an exception. It is worth pointing out that characters like Gingill, a bioethicist who studies exactly this subject, and more recently the Centre for Law and Genetics at the University of Tasmania, like you said, there's not universal agreement on this, but there are definitely people at the Centre of Law and Genetics who agree with me, has recently published a lot about how GGE is morally justifiable if it is done in good faith, i.e. improving quality of life as opposed to giving your kids blonde hair and blue eyes. That is not reflected in Australian law. So the experts actually do agree with me on this. It's just difficult to get this to translate into commonly accepted law. This is not least because of the stain of eugenics on GGE research, even in contexts where the motivations are clearly different. Poster's response. I want the ability to edit my children because I do not like the fact there is a glass ceiling on how high quality my life is. Genes are not perfect predictors of wellness, environment gets in the way. Quality of life may be improved by acting on an environment which affects everyone. Furthermore, you're considering traits in abstracto, like they're not correlated with others. As someone has pointed out, selecting/correcting genes for IQ may lead to affecting other traits, and the parents are very likely to not notice which and to which degree. You may not know what your child will inherit from you or your spouse. If you disagree, don't edit your kids, doesn't affect me. You may want the good for your kids, but it's not bound to be what's actually good for them. You're forcing a decision on them either postpartum or prepartum. They may resent when they grow up, as they will live on with the effect of this free choice you asked for. Genome editing for complex, unresolved traits may not be the best choice, both in medical and societal consequences. Most of its allure comes from the allure that our destiny lies in our genes, but it does not. That is the point of my argument, that the law should be keeping up with the science. This may vary according to one's value framework, and, chiefly, science may be wrong. It has been, and it will be. It's in its nature. OP response. Genes are not perfect predictors of wellness. I understand that. I am simply hedging my bets. You're forcing a decision on them either post or prepartum. I am also doing that by not editing them. Many people with a history of mental illness simply will not procreate because they do not want their children to grow up miserable. It's not obvious that GGE is the ethically incorrect choice in that example. I'm simply choosing the lesser of two evils. What if the gene that has been edited regulates another trait towards sickness? Again, for something like IQ, where CTY and Duke Tip students are constantly proven to have exceptional qualities of life, again, see Richard Heyer's work, there is good reason to think that IQ does not lead to serious illness. I am open-minded to evidence to the contrary, indeed that is why I published my argument on Reddit, but I have not seen it. Reading You're Going to Close the Thread, I'll be blunt, you can't edit for IQ. IQ is a statistic of a test that measures a facet of intelligence. Being a test-based measure, it is different from metrics like height that do not depend on performance. And I am leaving aside other possible biases. For how much it can be a predictor of wellness, it is just a facet of it. Since it tries to measure a complex trait, it is likely to be complex as well, that is, it is controlled by thousands of variants scattered in the genome. Even if we may resolve its genomic control, it is yet to see whether these genes affect other traits. In this sense, we do not know which after effect it may be changing these variants. And that said, editing thousands of variants is both hard and risky. The more the trials, the higher the chance of an error. I think you agree that any error is to be avoided when changing the genome of what can only be an embryo. Then let me repeat, environment comes in the way. Simply put, editing for IQ is no different from editing the colour of the eye, a vanity done in goodwill, but with many more risks and no assurance in the outcome. Last of all, the choice to and not to. The way I see it, and why I think choosing to edit my kids is different from not choosing the option, is we can use a technology not available to everyone that relies on imprecise knowledge to maybe have the chance that our kids will fare better, but we may also screw them for life in ways we cannot even fathom. So this is OP responding in a comment to points that frequently came up. So, if a father has a child at 20, he introduces on average 20 random genetic mutations into his children, other than that which is normal for recombination. If he is a child at 40, he introduces approximately 40. If your argument is that embryos cannot give consent, and therefore cannot consent to having genetic surgery that has the risk of potential genetic defects, does that mean we should stop parents from having children after a certain age? Additionally, I do not find arguments of embryo consent to be a strong argument. Parents are allowed to do all sorts of things with their children who are unable to give their consent as long as they are acting in good faith. And as for IQ being unimportant, why did David Goggins say he had to use all of his famous conscientiousness in order to just pass school, whereas other Navy SEALs get into Harvard? Why do the functioning aspects of the military complex, where every second is dedicated to improving the capabilities of candidates, fail to produce the mathematical competence of an 8-year-old John von Neumann? This is also a counter-argument against the Hitler problem. If Western regulations are too tight, there is a strong incentive for the relevant scientists to go over to China or Russia or North Korea, where more negative things could happen without sufficient regulations. Perversely, if you don't want negative consequences from eugenic motivations, giving the devil his due is the best thing you can do. People seem to have a strong naturalistic fallacy when it comes to genetic mutations, where if they are introduced randomly then that is good, but if it is introduced by a free market system of people acting within regulations then that is bad. If something could be done with genetic engineering, it was already being determined, just by factors that were outside of your control. To me at least, despite my flaws, it's not obvious that nature is more moral than I am as a parent. Another point that has come up frequently, I think it was Robert Plomin as well who brought up that IQ starts at 20% heritability when children are young, but grows to 40, 60 and finally 80% heritability in later life. This means that whilst it is technically true that IQ is largely environmental, it is not the sort of environmental intervention that can be easily implemented without corresponding biological interventions modifying the inherent desires of the subject. For example, if a child has a slight advantage in reading, which causes them to read more, which causes them to enjoy reading, which causes them to get better at reading, etc., then forcing children to read without other interventions does nothing useful. As a side note, I have no problem editing inherent desires of children, as long as it's done appropriately. I would much rather my child have an inherent passion for sport than an inherent passion for drugs. Whilst this exact example is debatable insofar as it can be edited biologically, many others are not. Final response. Genetic engineering, with caveats, is indeed a social good. Consider what artificial selection has done in the domain of plant and animal breeding. It's ridiculous to think that selecting for beneficial traits in plants and animals is good, but doing so with humans is bad. The rub with genetic engineering in humans is personal, parental choice. Parents already select for traits they want in their offspring when they choose a mate, but it's a dumb system which relies on chance. If parents could select the best embryos based on genetic traits, they would still be their children, but they would be the very best children they could possibly have. Likewise, deleterious traits could be selected against before condemning a child to a lifelong disability. OP. I'm not even specifically looking at embryo selection. I'm talking about having one child and removing all the genes that would provide that child with a poor quality of life and replacing them with alleles that provide them with a higher quality of life. If people disagree with this, then disagree with this. I should add on to this argument, however, that how exactly the negatives are going to be avoided is something that needs to be thought through deeply. The fact that genetic selection can and has done wrong in the past is one of the reasons why most of the comments on this thread are overwhelmingly negative. Gattaca, the film I cited in my post, has a society where parents select, quote, the very best embryos they could possibly have, and it's not a very flattering society. That's why my argument mostly revolves around pointing out how the alternative, doing nothing, is worse.
Thank you for sticking with me through that. I understand that was a lot of information. I created this video for numerous reasons, but foremost amongst them was to convince people that the apparent health and ethical problems with genetic engineering are not as bad as they might initially seem, and that not going forward with genetic engineering, particularly complex trait editing, had far worse consequences than people give it credit for. Progress is definitely being made, but at a snail's pace, meaning despite it being over a decade since CRISPR was first hyped as a breakthrough in biological science, it has been far less influential than equivalently powerful technologies like AI, which were discovered later. This is not least because the controversial and challenging aspects of the IQ literature and problems like it, I focus on IQ as the shocking inequality it revealed is what motivated me into this field, however the same could be said about other health and complex trait inequalities, are sheltered from the general public. This means that people aren't aware of just how bad these problems really are, and therefore there is little demand to solve it where it actually matters. To give an example, Elon Musk is someone who is famous for addressing big issues like AI misalignment, space colonization, sustainable energy, and other equally large-scale problems. However, despite admitting in an interview with Tim Urban that he thought the scientific and technological challenges of genetic engineering were fundamentally solvable, he has stayed away from the subject specifically because he does not know how to navigate the Hitler problem. After all, what defines a perfect person? I am not pushing for perfection. I am arguing that there are traits associated with health where it is clearly the case that more of this trait is good in virtually every measurable dimension and less is bad. Genetically engineering a child to not have major depression is different from genetically engineering them to be, quote, perfect, and this extends to a lot more than just major depression. If you can make it so that these traits which are overwhelmingly positive are identified and the sorts of things that people can willingly integrate into their bloodline through biotechnology, as long as they are acting within bioethical guidelines and are genuinely doing what they think is best, then I think you can make at least some progress on this subject without the Hitler problem being an impediment. One potential mental block Elon and people like him may have is that they often emphasise that people would not want to be them if they knew what their lives were like. I completely agree. However, it is unlikely to be because they are simply just high in IQ, but because they are high in multiple traits at the same time, combined with unique environmental life influences, which make them 1 in a billion people. Those other traits and environmental influences may have positive and negatives, and many of those negatives may be profound, but this does not invalidate the mountain of evidence that traits like IQ are overwhelmingly positive in and of themselves. I know it's naive to think that Elon Musk is watching this, or will be inspired to get into genetic engineering from my interventions alone, but no one else is saying anything, so it may as well be me. Elon, if you're watching this, I have this existential crisis so that you didn't have to. If you've taken a good cold look at just how bad these problems are and still conclude that genetic engineering is not worth pursuing, then that is your choice. However, I am not convinced that people are affected enough by the walloping magnitude of biological inequalities to look at the issues fairly. I don't want to live in a caste system where a small proportion of exceptionally talented people are the only ones able to escape the rat race as society becomes more complex, and if that means I have to go to China or some other non- or anti-Western governments and fund their economies instead, then I will do that if that is the best option of a bad bunch. Remember that you yourself were motivated to start the Department of Government Efficiency because of your distrust of much that goes on in public institutions and NGOs, and these criticisms could easily translate to the NIH, UN, and the Centre for Genetics and Society, so I would thoroughly encourage you to question the apparent consensus on the ethics of genetic engineering. To everyone else, please share this video and get my message out in the world, so we can finally bring about the genetic revolution.
So now let's do a thought experiment. And let's imagine there's an IQ pill. And I mean that metaphorically, not literally a pill you could take, like putting, but like having fluoridated water just kind of raises the dental health of everybody. It would be nice if we had that for IQ, but just imagine what it would be like if we shifted the distribution of IQ 15 points into the high end, so that now the average IQ, and I understand how IQ is computed and norming and everything, but the point is that no one would have an IQ less than 100.
Right.
What would the world be like if everyone could reason sufficiently to get a reasonable job?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I mean, the what would you call the perverse part of me? It's funny. I was just talking to one of my graduate students. We've been looking at the determinants of male attractiveness by the personality of female viewers. Okay, and so what we found is that there are some personality effects. So extroverted, enthusiastic women tend to rate men, generally speaking, as more attractive than introverted and less enthusiastic women. And so there are some just straight personality effects, but the biggest effect by far we found was the proclivity of women in general to rate men as less attractive as the women's IQ increased. And so the other thing that we don't know is what price we pay for accelerated IQ from a broader perspective, because I know that there is some evidence, and you can tell me what you think about this, because I know that there's reasonable evidence that the average IQ of the Ashkenazi Jewish population is about 15 points higher than the standard population, which kind of makes it a thought experiment real life experiment that's equivalent to the one that you laid out. But Ashkenazi Jews also tend to suffer from a host of neurological diseases that seem to be associated with increased neuroplasticity. And so, to me, it's often hard to gain on one front without losing on another. I mean, that's the evolutionary conundrum, obviously, but
we call that the social justice theory. If you've done one thing, you have to be bad on everything else to kind of balance it out.
Yeah, well, generally speaking, you do pay a price for your exceptionalism.
I don't think that's true because the Julian Stanley studies of the mathematically precocious kids essentially found not only were they smart, but they were more mature than their age peers. Yeah. They were better looking. They were taller. They were physically more fit. I mean, it was kind of the anti-social.
Yeah, no, that's true.